Alrighty, so welcome to Class 2 of SOCB50, Deviance and Normality. Thanks everyone for showing up today. I hope your summer term is off to a really great start. And this, as we know, is our first kind of real lecture on course material. Last week, for those of you that weren't here or didn't watch the course on web option, last week was a general introduction to kind of my take on deviance and how we will be exploring deviance first through the lens of crime. So again, just a quick refresher, this course is about how people stray or find themselves wanting to stray from social norms. So things like dropping out of school, becoming a pro gamer, engaging in criminal activities. Two of those things are things I did, not three. So yeah, I realized that maybe in the future, who knows? We'll work our way up to deviance, but this week is very foundational for the entire course. So it may be a bit of a dense lecture, but I hope you find it enjoyable. So the theme of this class, this particular week, it has kind of a pretentious title, Classicism and Positivism in sociology or in criminology. But really, this week I think boils down to two very simple ideas, or one core split in how people think about anything social, not just crime and deviance. So we'll see the study of crime and deviance, what make those topics, or the pairing of those topics, so exciting to me personally, is that these are issues that everyone thinks about, everyone cares about to some extent. No one wants to be violated, and at the same time, no one wants to feel as though they're outcast by society for being a quote-unquote violator or deviant or criminal. No one really wants to feel outside of their social niche. Yet, at the same time, we don't necessarily just want to be like everyone else. So deviance is something inherent in the human condition, and we'll see that two ways of thinking about this issue really map on to the fundamental paradox that human life is. The fact that we have to follow norms and laws and codes and rituals and ceremonies and all this stuff, like being here, being in higher education for some, whether it's for intrinsic education, whether it's for the idea that you'll get a job afterwards. You have to do things you don't always want to do. And the reasons why you sometimes become frustrated or don't do those things, deviate away from those things, we'll see there are two major kinds of explanations, two root causes for your sense of frustration. And we'll see this week is, as I said, it's foundational to the rest of the course and really to thinking about social behavior more generally in any sociology course, because we'll see on the one hand, deviance is the product, or crime and deviance are the products of people's individual agency and rationality on the one hand, with the classical school or classicism, or crime and deviance are things that people are pushed into, either by internal biological drives. We'll see that's largely been moved away from as racist and sexist theories. But what's more popular now is seeing people being pushed into crime by external forces. So this is a fundamental debate, and what people get in political arguments about and social arguments about, moving away from crime and deviance even, to what extent is our behavior the product of our own agency or the product of the structures within us and outside of us. So again, this is an exciting week. The readings weren't super long, but as I said, these are questions that haven't gone away. And the course will actually end, as I mentioned, with intersectionality and biosocial criminology, looking at structure and agency in two very different ways, but addressing really these same kind of fault lines and issues. So this week we will look at the classical school. So we read the first kind of chapter from that Tierney kind of course textbook that we'll read a few chapters of throughout the term. And then we read an article or another book chapter from a different book comparing kind of the core modern classical theory, which is rational choice theory, which is what it sounds like, that people just make rational choices, with routine activities theory, which, as I'll explain, kind of will be a middle ground between the like hyper-agency rational choice theory on the one hand and the I have no control over myself Lombrosian positivistic view. Routine activities theory kind of looks at both sides in a way. So as I mentioned last week, the history of criminology is not linear. Now I'm hoping you're seeing in part it's due to, as we'll see today, in part the lack of linearity is due to this bifurcated, I know that was an exam question I had in Sociology 3, bifurcated consciousness, but bifurcated or split view of human nature. So contemporary criminology as we know it now emerged roughly 120 years ago, but so roughly around 1900. But thoughts of how and why people engage in crime have lasted or been with us forever. So this moment of the formation of criminology, as I said last week, remember this, the book you're reading parts of is British. And because we are a kind of British colony, I've chosen that as kind of the foundational period in which we'll see our theories arise. This was a period, so the 1800s, so let's just say for this course, modern criminology, modern study of crime, you can see as starting in like 1880, let's just say. The numbers are varied depending what you read. For the past 100 years, so mid-1700s, 1800s, there were huge upsurges in crime and deviance in Britain. This was a time when the feudal lords were cast off, industrialization was newly growing, and people who formerly lived in self-subsisting farms, so people, husbands and wives with lots of kids, humaning their own properties, creating food for owners that would lease the farm to them. The situation changed, and now men had to work in factories, and women were relegated to the newly created private sphere. So separation of spheres happened. People were not happy about it on whole. While this gave people the promise of riches and industry, this was coming off after the Enlightenment, which the principles were everyone's created equal. Just because you were born a certain way, like born a peasant, doesn't mean you're any less of a human than the aristocratic lord above you. So while the ideas here were very liberating, the reality was, okay, well, how do you liberate yourself? By like trucking yourself to a new, very dirty city and working in a factory for 16 hours a day, or being stuck in a very small apartment, raising children and basically just and having children and having high infant mortality rates, in a relatively short lifespan, and all of these things. So the ideals of this period were very high. We'll see this is important when we get to strain theory, the disjuncture between ideals and then actual conditions. But so this was a time period that historians and criminologists say bred crime and deviance, because people are promised and they're thought, I'm going to have this great new life, but things aren't quite that way. And I think that's a feeling we all have at different points in our life, right, where our expectations don't meet what's going on. Structures of the city were also very amenable to crime, in that rather than having like scattered big plots of lands with farms, you had a lot of tight-knit buildings which had alleyways, lots of places where thieves could run away, multiple stores to loot. You didn't know people as well, so you didn't have maybe the emotional connection or the community eye on you, kind of preventing you from deviance. So as we'll see, a lot of kind of structural factors, really just living conditions, prompted this crime. But again, the core function was people having some sort of disconnect with their new way of life. So this focus on seeing crime and deviance as kind of the response of an otherwise potentially quote-unquote normal person, a law-abiding citizen, think this way of like a former farmer now becoming, a highwayman. So a highwayman was someone that did, that would rob coaches, stagecoaches, so horses and buggies as they were going along the new routes into the city. Many of them would do this sort of crime just because they couldn't put food on the table for their now wife, who was a stay-at-home mother. So this was a whole new situation. So there was economic need and, again, frustration. So Marx, you'll see in the tree of knowledge and tree of sin, using this idea that this moment where many people are engaging in crime, stores are being looted, and the state, merchant groups, so like store owners, people of means who own houses and apartments, landlords, they all want to solve this crime, or these crimes. Marx goes and says, well, if we really want, and he's by no means a criminologist, he's interested in class and power and money stuff. But he has some interesting contributions here, which is mainly his statement that if we really want to understand the nature of crime and deviance, we have to see this whole field of study as really emerging, not from the academy, but emerging from these people's actions. So this, again, furthers the point that the study of crime and deviance is a practical part of sociology. People were not necessarily theorizing about it in the ivory tower, but they were responding to real people engaging in real acts of crime that real people were resisting. So Marx says the criminal produces the criminal law. So this is reflected in most Western countries, Western democracies, where laws are negative sanctions. So they're saying, like, you can't do X, you can't do Y. And these laws emerge out of criminal actions. So for example, someone assaults someone on the street, and then a law is created saying you cannot assault for, in XYZ spaces. Here are the kinds of sentences that a criminal will get for doing this. Think of marital rape, the example I used last class, of that action, which was not seen as criminal up until like 50 years ago, that action then becoming criminalized and codified as women got more rights in the country. So Marx says, again, what makes criminology and the study of deviance very significant and interesting to study is that the laws that are created and the sentiments we have around crime come from the criminals themselves. So it's a practical discipline. And so the central questions that criminologists ask then mirror and respond or correspond to the questions that everyday civilians ask. Who does the crime? So let's say I'm moving into a new neighborhood that has a bad stereotype about it. So think there's always the negative stereotype in Toronto of Jane and Finch. When someone is moving to that neighborhood, they may think, okay, who do I have to be careful around? They then, if they're more socially conscious or they want to help the area, they may say, why do they do it? What are the causes? And then more recently, if they really start to unpack what's going on and look at, structural causes of certain people joining gangs or doing graffiti or whatever the issues are, they may then start to say, okay, why are these individuals' behaviors being labeled as crime? Why is crime a classed and racialized phenomenon in our society? So again, lots of lofty things in the text, but pretty simple so far. Again, think of the last 300 years as having spikes in crime. We'll see recently they've been going down every year. But spikes in crime, roughly 200 years ago, leading to politicians, academics, and an important point, again, the people that really defined these laws and these codes and kind of created a stable resistance to crime and criminals, were people of means, meaning they had wealth and they had social status. So even though crime comes from, the study of crime comes from the quote-unquote criminals, the way that it was interpreted was kind of classed from the beginning. So as I stated before, seeing criminology as a science was what was created in this last 120 years. So people have always been interested in crime, but it took this moment of people moving into newly industrialized zones. We'll see that next week with concentric zone theory and social disorganization theory. There's tons of theories. Really, that's the birth of modern criminology. Gets huge in like the 1920s. The Chicago School, literally studying Chicago, which for any of you that know its geography, has tons of like little neighborhoods within it, and hotbeds of crime and areas where people will go between. Okay, so classicism and positivism, how do they fit into this big history? So just before I proceed, so any questions so far? So again, this is meant to be a kind of broad, quick and dirty history. I give it in almost all my classes. So for people that, that have been in my other classes, you'll be, I said this so many times, the Industrial Revolution. But it's important, and it always impacts everything in sociology because we're a new field. And that's the moment we're all responding to, usually. Okay, so classicism and positivism. So important to see here, again, is that criminology only emerged like not even a couple hundred years ago. And as Marx said, it emerged from the actions of individuals. So the first way that people interested in addressing crime, and this is key, the first kind of wave of addressing this came from people who strongly embraced Enlightenment values. So these were not a series of people who thought, oh, those quote-unquote criminals are just a bunch of stupid or inferior people doing this. They tended instead to think that they were just people. Again, the foundation of the United States of America, it was gendered, but it was all men are created equal. And most of the time when they're talking about criminals, they're talking about men as well, because of the, again, women being relegated to the private sphere mostly at this time. But so the general impetus of the classical school was that all people are created equal, and if someone becomes a criminal or a deviant or does something awful, it's not because there's something inherent in them. You know, we already proved that peasants and feudal lords are really the same. They're just different because of the circumstances they were in. So for the classical school, they just somehow have become misguided, literally misguided. And so the state, misguided by law, misguided by custom, misguided by tradition, by the burgeoning science. So the role of the academic and the political person here and educators was simply to inform people that what they may have thought were rational choices. So for example, my wife and children are at home, I need to feed them, there's no job for me, or like I got in a big fight with my boss at the factory, or there's abuse going on. My rational response might be to steal from someone. These scholars and these thinkers and these people of the time would say, no, that's not the rational response, because the odds of you getting caught are high, and you will be punished and you will be marked. And there are other options for you. So we'll see this way of thinking still remains today, obviously, when you think of deterrence and crime control strategies. Again, I taught a policing course several times, and this is, you know, when you think of, we'll get to it later, but when you think of rehabilitative models of policing, they're often about re-educating people about the options they have available to them, even in very constrained situations. Back to school programs, government grants, and all the things you may see now. So the classical school, again, was premised on the fact that people are equal, and one thing that makes them equal is that we're all driven by what they call the utilitarian principle. You'll see all different names for this. Sometimes it's like the felicitous, calculus, hedonic resonance. Basically, it just means a behavior in our own minds is rational if it leads to more pleasure than pain. So the thinking here is quite simple. It's that, oh, you know, kind of think of like the spunky radical teenager who goes and does graffiti, usually, again, stereotypically a guy, but also very common women as well, doing drugs in public, getting in fights with their parents. they're hedonistic. They're often called that. People who like move away from home and like move to California or somewhere sunny or something. They're seen as being short-term thinking. Parents are always trying to teach their kids not to do that and to think long-term. So rational choice theory in this way is very much of that, or this style of thinking that people have very much comes from this school, the classical school, which again sometimes I'll call the rational school, because that's really what it's about. That people think they're being rational, and they are, but they're being rational from their own perspective, not from society's. And so society needs to reform itself to make sure that people know, no, you should be making this decision, not that. You're a smart person, you just don't have the knowledge that you need to have. So the central principles of the classical school are that crime deterrence, and it should be clear, so people should know what they are. So that's what I was saying there. The central concern is a reformed, so again, they're saying, think of them as social planners, social engineers. They're saying, how did we let the society get this way? Well, let's take the blame, and we just didn't make, conformity to our society or the following of our rules clear enough for people. Remember Durkheim, as we'll see next week, but remember just from any intro class or theory class that you've taken, Durkheim very much saw this time period as full of anomie, right? He said people are normless, they don't know what they're doing. So reforming means we need to make it easier for people. Make it clear that crime doesn't pay, tell them how to get a job, tell them how to deal with a bad boss, all of those things. And then efficient and equitable means, again, the same as when you're teaching like a pet something. If they do a negative behavior, you want to punish them right away. It's the same idea with humans and children. Children are humans too. The same with children and adults. That when they deviate from you, you want to let them know right away. Just like in a classroom, you want to nip something in the bud. You want to give someone constructive feedback right away. And then you want to do it fairly. So if someone slaps someone in public, should that be the same as murdering someone? So equitable there, it means fair and efficient. So again, ultimately here, deterrence is through a rational legal order. It makes sense, it's codified, and it's fair. And here, this distinguishes the criminal from the non-criminal, not in the way, as we'll see, that positivists like Lombroso see, where it's someone born a criminal or someone that just can't help it. But this is distinguishing a rational criminal from a rational non-criminal. So even though and you'll see this is the biggest criticism of this school, even you could make the perfect society, quote unquote, where everyone has options for everything. But there will still be people who deviate from that. And this is what gives rise to the positivist critique, as we'll see later. Namely that, as Durkheim says, crime and deviance are always present. And again, just think of your own life. Think of people who get mad, who get emotional about things, who quit things or leave things or break up with people. Again, we're not always perfect or just following the same, conforming to the same norms all of the time. So this explanation, as we'll see, it may not always be that we're rationally thinking, okay, this isn't working for me, I'm going to do something else. We may just have some other sort of frustration that, as we'll see, causes the kind of paradox that hasn't gone away. Yep.
Can I just ask a question about the equity? Is it about the spectrum of crime, like minor crimes to major, or is it about treating everybody equally?
Both. Yep, so great question. So the equity, so it being there, an equitable system of justice, it just means the whole system is fair. So in terms of people, it's not biasing certain kinds of people. As we see it obviously through history, there still are problems with racial minorities typically getting longer sentences and things like that. But in the ideal, it was supposed to be that, do the crime, get the time, and different crimes have different sentences, and it wasn't really supposed to be that much about the person unless it was a question of motive, or being in a mental state where you could justify doing the crime because you didn't know, like criminal negligence. That would be manslaughter versus first-degree murder, things like that. Those would add or reduce sentences. Again, in this idea of equitable. Okay. So to help clarify this a bit further, I have a little, for your first study buddy question. So for those of you who weren't here last week, You're out of luck. No study buddies for you. No, I'm joking. You can have a study buddy. So go and find someone. You know, everyone has to sit near someone. We'll now watch a short video discussing some of the key premises and assumptions of the classical school of criminology. What are the 5 principles of the classical school? So they describe it a bit differently, and I would hint for the midterm. You may not have to know the principles exactly, because I'll discuss how I'm going to make the test. But I think this is a really useful little 3-minute video that explains kind of what I just said in my 20 minutes in 3 minutes. So I think it's a good video. And they describe it differently, so it won't be redundant, hopefully.
But during the second half of the 17th century, a new movement known as the Enlightenment theory began. What?
Ooh, okay. Okay. Oh, that works. Lag. So it's a little bit fast, but do you ever listen to things on slower speed? Or does no one do that? On faster speed. Okay. Okay, I do that too. Okay, fine. But if it gets too fast, just let me know and I can slow it down.
During the second half of the 17th century, a new movement known as the Enlightenment theory began. But from the Enlightenment came a school of thought known as the Classical School of Criminology, which emphasizes the ideas that people make choices to commit crime, and that punishment should be about preventing future crimes from being committed. Let's look closer at the Classical School of Criminology, including its influence on modern law. Jordan is interested in criminology, and he's heard that things before the Enlightenment were pretty bad for criminals, and people suspected of being criminals. But he's still not quite sure what the Classical School of Criminology is about. To understand the Classical School, Jordan's teacher tells him to remember the 5 key principles of the Classical School of Criminology. Number 1, rationality. The Classical School assumes that people have free will and that they choose to commit crimes. For example, if Jordan decides to steal some candy at the store, he is not forced to based on some predestiny. He chooses to steal that candy. Number 2, hedonism. The Classical School also assumes that people seek pleasure and try to avoid pain. Number 3, punishment.
Yeah, it does that.
Remember how we said that a key idea was the idea of hedonism, where people seek pleasure and try to avoid pain? Well, that informs punishment according to the Classical School. For example, if Jordan thinks about stealing the candy, and then realizes that he could go to jail for it, he might not steal it because he'll be trying to avoid the pain of jail. Number 4, human rights. Jordan has learned that before the Classical School of Criminology, punishments could be very harsh indeed. According to the Classical School of Criminology, all individuals have rights, and society needs to respect the rights of the individuals. Number 5, due process. The idea of due process is that people accused of a crime are considered innocent until proven guilty, and that they have the chance to go to trial and face the judicial system. If Jordan was accused of stealing the candy, and then just thrown in jail without a trial, that would be a violation of his due process. The 5 principles of the Classical School of Criminology sound very familiar to Jordan. He's heard people talk about punishment for crimes as a deterrent, and he's heard that it's important to uphold human rights and to avoid cruel and unusual punishment. He's also heard of due process and the phrase innocent until proven guilty. The reason much of the Classical School's principles are familiar to Jordan is because it has had a major impact on our modern judicial system. All modern justice systems assume that people have free will and choose to commit crimes. This is a direct descendant of the Classical School principle.
Oops. Yeah, so again, I think it was, yeah. So let's leave that up for a second if you didn't get the principles. So again, rationality, we talked about. Hedonism was the pleasure-pain principle. So again, rationality, assumption of free will, but also that remember, if you're being a little bit more charitable about that, it's not just that you have free will to commit the crime, but from your own perspective, you think it makes sense. And you think it makes sense because you think it'll bring you more pleasure than pain. So we'll get to this later in the course, but when we look at things like differential association theory and strain theory, oftentimes people may turn to crime or deviance if they think, you know, sure, maybe I could take some other legitimate route to becoming rich or famous or happy. So even if you think of deviance just of like depression and mental health, sure, maybe that would work, but I'm not convinced. So oftentimes people will deviate. Someone could drop out of a program, leave a relationship because they think the pleasure will not outweigh the pain, right? So I think mental health makes that extremely clear when you're thinking, you know, okay, sure, here's a route I could rationally see myself going, but I just don't believe that that will work for me. So then you stay at home or quit a job or something. Then punishment is, here again, the knowing ahead of time feeds into that process of, you know, maybe I'm unhappy and I think I'll be happy because if I rob a store and get money, but then the punishment deters me. And then lastly, human rights and due process. Again, this was foundational because they were rejecting previous ideas that kind of said certain classes of individuals should have less rights than others. The foundation of the United States, for example, the Declaration was about getting rid of that and then having due process to open up this process. So rather than just having one judge or jury kind of be like dictators on the sentencing right away, you had a jury come in, or you had a judge, you know, you could petition sentences and things like that. So due process was the idea that you're innocent, and you're innocent because all people are assumed innocent and rational and having free will, but potentially becoming misguided. And then if you're proven to be someone who's deeply misguided, so someone like Ted Bundy or something, then you're given punishment to the full extent of the law. And again, this is all the ideal version of this school. So what I want you to, in your study buddy question, this is more about chatting with your partner and then writing down some notes just so I can see what everyone thinks. But talk about the 5 principles with your partner, and then think about or discuss what you think. So the important question here for me, what do these principles imply about the motives of offenders or those who commit crimes? So given the 5 principles of the school, what do you think it's saying about the motives of people? So for those alone, you should try to pair up. Because again, this is more about the discussion than the writing. So just want to see what you think. I want to keep it sticking. All right. So does anyone want to share what them and their study buddies think about what this school implies about the motives of offenders? Yep.
Okay. Although crime is always committed as a result of actions that were willingly taken, crime is usually done for what is seen as a logical reason from the perspective of the perpetrator. Furthermore, people may commit crimes because they feel that it will lead to a pleasant outcome for them, likely more than the risks that come with committing the said crime.
Thus implying they actually want to commit the crime.
Mm-hmm. So we'll see this idea, so fantastic response, the idea that offenders actually want to do the crime. This is part of what keeps the classical school alive in contemporary debates. We'll see this in the situational schools in the second half of the course. But one of the central fault lines in contemporary criminology is to what extent is crime or deviance inherently attractive to people versus to what extent are they kind of reluctantly doing it. So again, the cases of people like Ted Bundy, Eileen Wuornos, like serial killers and people, you know, mafia members and things, people who seem to enjoy and actually kind of recount, I mean, Ted Bundy denied it, but many people actually will talk about the thrill and the seduction of crime. So this aspect, it's not just rational, but I like that idea of seeing the component of desire or wanting to do it because of this hedonistic impulse that we all have of sometimes wanting to do something we know we shouldn't do. Anything else? Yep.
I was going to say, in terms of due process, like proving guilty is kind of hard because, for example, nowadays, like people who claim like mental insanity care for the person who was innocent because of the person, in order for a crime to be legit, mens rea and actus reus must be, like, you know, both those two elements have to be there. So it's difficult to prove if a person is insane and therefore the person must be excused, or it's really difficult to like judge what's fair and what's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the whole idea of equity, fairness, due process was introduced by this school, and as we'll see, the tension between more deterministic theories like positivism and stronger versions of this school, the classical school or rational choice theory, come down to those questions of to what extent, so maybe this person desires to be a murderer or whatever, but to what extent are those desires actually their own choice? So is it something simpler to see like it's an external constraint, so the person was abused or they had no money, but what if now, and we're seeing this more with the case, we'll show a video of that later, but more with the internal biological things, could someone's desire to deviate from societal norms come from early childhood traumas or socialization experiences, not just something inherently biological like Lombroso, as we'll see, assumed. Yeah. Yep.
I was going to also add that this theory assumes like rationality out of everyone, but that itself is kind of not equal because, you know, what's rationality, right?
Right, and we'll see that too, that the idea of rationality comes, it's really assuming a certain kind of educated middle-class sensibility. So knowledge of the laws on the one hand, so not just intelligence, but also conformity to those things. So it's very much assuming that anyone in his or her right mind would obey society's laws. So again, it's something that's very conservative in a Durkheimian way of kind of maintaining the status quo, whatever that is. So we'll just address a few more things and then we'll have our 10-minute break. So I'll just kind of introduce positivism. So positivism, so this week can be confusing because these schools are so broad that I do not, and at least we have the benefit of this being recorded, so you can come back to this. I promise future ones will be clearer. But this one is particularly murky because these are schools, but I still have to define them in terms of this course, right? So they're not just theories, like you'll learn other theories in later classes. These are two huge schools, and I'm kind of just showing you certain exemplars of them. So positivism is harder to explain because there's really multiple branches. So the first way to understand this is that is to contextualize it and situate it in history. So as we all should likely know, looking back 150, 120, 200 years in that rough time period, thinking of Britain, thinking of America, this was a highly racist time. So as much as people were embracing Enlightenment principles and they wanted to move away from ideas of people as being, you know, different castes and having different intrinsic worth, there was a lingering and in many places often growing sentiment shared by majority members of the population, majority white, that much of the criminality you were seeing was coming either from racialized persons or from people kind of being influenced by those persons. So positivism in its first iterations centered around racial and genetic theories. Remember, this was also a time period where, say, if you were Irish, so many different kinds of backgrounds that now would kind of just be considered white, many variations of white heritage were also seen as kind of, quote unquote, black versions of the race. So they were seen also as inferior for different reasons. So these individuals were often kind of scapegoated or seen as the ones responsible for the crime surge. And again, this was around the world pretty well in countries influenced by the West. So Lombroso was key in kind of speaking against the classical school in terms of crime, saying, okay, this theory that you've posited, that everyone has access to rationality, that everyone's the same, that they just don't know better, this doesn't fit what I'm seeing, which is that criminals kind of seem to be somewhat similar to one another. And so first of all, they're mostly men. Second of all, they're mostly young, so like between age 20 and 30 roughly. And third, I'm going to go out and measure their skull sizes and phenotypes, so he really goes all the way. They tend to be of darker complexions, they tend to have bigger eyebrows. He dissects all of these things into what he calls the criminal man, and says, actually, sure, maybe the rational perspective applies to quote-unquote normal civilized people, but the majority of criminals are actually cut from a different cloth. So both within race and across race. So he says even within the white population, they may be people with more Irish descent. They may have, again, bushier eyebrows, bigger skull sizes, smaller parts of the brain, bigger other parts, but there are genetic differences. So this was the first kind of intervention in the growing field of criminology at the time. Again, it was very young. And the major argument was, again, it was mostly, again, they mostly saw black individuals as responsible for crime, but criminals in general were seen as quote-unquote throwbacks to earlier, more criminogenic people, often to Neanderthals. Again, kind of the Homo sapiens, which is what we are. Neanderthals kind of had more of those features I was talking about. Again, the bigger skull size, smaller brain, bigger nose, bigger jaw, often kind of looking, like a quote-unquote barbarian. So here this was an intervention to all of this, saying we need to look at factors that people cannot control. So while the classical school was governmental and reform-based, again, it was we have a uniform population that we can mold into law-abiding, conforming citizens. We've created a state on the principle that people are fair or that people are equal, and so let's just make sure they actually do this so the society works. The first strong version of positivism, and again, the distinction's important, Lombrosian positivism. So it was Cesare Lombroso who came up with these genetic theories. You'll see next week that Tierney calls Durkheim a positivist. Later, Travis Hershey will call Merton a positivist. They're not saying they're racist at all. This is very different. They just subscribe to a certain causal view. But so Lombrosian positivism has the genetic and the genetic and racial component. Again, this is confusing now, but it'll become quite clear when you see the charges against Durkheim, because that's something new for him. I'm sure he would say, what? I don't think that about race, but he does see people's behavior as largely caused from circumstances they can't control. So the shift here, again, the classical school is about reforming the state. Positivism, Lombrosian positivism, becomes quite dangerous because instead of reforming the state, it's about individuals and eventually leading to things like eugenics. So the idea of saying, well, you know what? Not only can maybe some people not think through deviant actions properly, but maybe they can't be rehabilitated. Maybe there's something in them that's preventing them from that. Yeah.
So could we use the Lombrosian, like, positivist theory, like, and apply it to what Hitler did in, like, World War II?
Exactly, yeah. Yep, so the eradication of Jewish individuals in Nazi Germany, the proposed eugenics movements in the early 20th century of lower IQ individuals, and even in Toronto, in Canada, there were movements spearheaded by people that wanted to do those things. these are all following Lombrosian positivism. So when you think, okay, certain people are either beyond rehabilitation or it's too much work for the state to do that and it's better to just weed them out. So again, this positivism, the reason why people are rightly critical of it is that it leads to population genocides. And so, yeah, so I would say the clearest example of that is Nazi Germany, where he just wanted to eradicate that population for a series of reasons that he thought made them inferior to Anglo-Saxons. So when we come back, we will continue that. For now, just think in your minds, just think, okay, we had the rational school, people are all equal, and now we have this intervention. Again, the strongest version of it, you'll see, I'll make the maybe shocking parallel that positivism, seen in its weaker assumptions, as we'll see, was actually largely influential on the ideas of rehabilitation. Because if you weaken this, if you remove the genetic component of positivism, the central argument that it has is that maybe people aren't choosing to be criminals. Maybe there's something pushing them into it. And so it actually, you'll see contemporary criminology is a blend of both of these positions, but criminologists criticize one another for saying, you're basically being like Lombroso by saying that a person's situation causes their crime. You're removing their agency. Whereas someone sensitive to those issues may say, from a structural perspective, may say, well, you're not taking into account the barriers that people face in certain communities, or the barriers that someone has by being traumatized as a child, and how those may make them not, easily able to conform to society. How do you humanize a person's situation without dehumanizing them in the process? That's something, contemporary. That's an issue we have now. Okay, so we'll come back in 10 minutes and we will round off our discussion of positivism. Alrighty. So, positive criminology, as we'll see, you might think, whoa, based on what I just talked about Lombroso, it's shocking to see that it's dominant until the 1960s. That's why I made the distinction important. As we'll see, positivism, as I'm going to define it now, is very different from Lombrosian positivism. Or again, you can see it as a spectrum, with Lombroso being much more akin to something like Nazi Germany, but lighter positivism, as we'll see through critiques throughout the course, as more being structuralist arguments that argue that people may be pushed into crime for a variety of reasons. So you'll see the interpretive sociology. So when we move to thinkers such as Jack Katz, in what I call the situational school, and even in differential association with Edwin Sutherland, a series of thinkers started to critique dominant criminology for assuming that people have too little capacity for rationality, too little capacity to resist, and come up with things on their own. So positivism more generally is a method that attempts to be extremely scientific in the sense of natural science. So it is about creating causal arguments such as, A leads to B given C conditions. They try to isolate independent and dependent variables and come up with relatively clear solutions to problems. So positivism was very attractive in this time period. So again, now thinking of like the late 1800s, it was very attractive because it lended itself to policy implications more clearly. So while the rational school, or the classical school more broadly, the classical school argued that society needs to be reformed, we need more equitable laws, we need to make sure people know about crimes. Positivism said, okay, well, let's look into the sources of deviance and the root causes that may make crime more attractive for some people. Again, the classical school was seen as too broad and too ambitious, and also too vague in the sense of, you would just be informing people about why they shouldn't give in to their quote-unquote hedonistic motives. The positivistic school was a response to that by saying, well, maybe sometimes acting rationally might be difficult. Maybe there are certain conditions, certain internal things. So let's say someone, now there are studies, as we'll see, that look at people's levels of aggression, look at the impact of trauma on like antisocial personality disorders, but at the same time, look at the impact of, say, living in a quote-unquote disorganized neighborhood where there's lots of crime. All of these other factors fall into this broader positivistic school, which really, if you go to the source of the word positivism in science, is developing principles that you can use to guide future research. So the classical school, seen as too broad and resting on this kind of ephemeral notion of like human rationality, and the positivistic school saying, well, let's kind of disempower the person to an extent and say that a lot of our behaviors are habitual, somewhat automatic, influenced by our families, influenced by our neighborhood, influenced by our own emotions. So in criminology, and again, I'm making positivism sound good here because I just made it sound so bad with Lombroso. It's somewhere in the middle at this point, as we'll see with its key assumptions. But the key questions that positivistic criminologists would ask: why do some individuals break the law? So again, we see contrast in the classical school. There's a big focus on individuals. So why does this individual do this? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What do people like them think or feel? How can criminals be reformed? So rather than reforming the state, there are groups of individuals, hoodlums, gangsters, whatever the cause is. If you're using a racist theory, racialized people, men, or whatever the group is, the question is, how do we reform these people to make them not want to do that sort of crime? And then lastly, what can be done to prevent them from wanting to break the law in the first place? What conditions could be changed around them, or what could we teach them early on or punish them with? Again, there are many negative examples of positivism in practice. Think of residential schools in Canada about getting this potentially deviant population kind of in check and conforming with mainstream society early in life. So again, it's not rosy. So the assumptions of this school, as we'll see, and this is the central fault line with the classical school, it assumes determinism, differentiation, and pathology. So even the most sensitive positivist, so again, I'll use the example not only because it may not seem like it, but even many social workers, when they're trying to rehabilitate an offender, they're operating on the assumption that that person's behavior is pathological, meaning it's not helpful to society or it's not helpful to them. Pathology, coming from disease, is a disease metaphor. So you may think, and even, I won't get into the whole field of it, but if you look at different schools of social work, they have bitter battles with one another, say like U of T, Sociology with Ryerson and York, on the extent to which you can see kind of people's behavior as needing to conform to society or society needing to change. So there's like critical social work, mainstream social work. So all of these things, again, don't go around saying, oh, he's saying social workers are like Lombroso, because I'm not saying that at all. But think of an interaction you may have had with a medical professional or something, and they seem to be pathologizing your behavior, trying to fix you or cure you. That comes from this. So the intentions can be good, but even like kids with their parents, your behavior is often pathologized, and really that's coming from these assumptions. So let's see the assumption of determinism. So here, individuals, as I've said, are pushed, and importantly, for Lombroso it was only internal, but for positivists more generally, and we'll see this with Durkheim, we'll see this with Merton, we'll see this Hershey critiquing this in the following week. They're pushed into crime by either or both internal and external factors. So if I'm someone who has abnormally high levels of aggression, let's say I'm just upset by everything, and I'm physically violent as a kid, that could be something that leads me to want to deviate. If I have severe ADHD and it's very hard for me to sit still, and I'm put in a context where people are expecting that of me, I may be very hard for me to not resist that. If I'm a bundle of energy and I have to control that in ways other people don't. Similarly, it could be something external. If my parents are literally trying to tell me to commit crime, if they bash quote unquote normal society, if my friends around me are telling me that makes me going into that rational, normal thought process very difficult. If I'm flooded by stimulation, either my own organism or society or both, take someone who feels like a bundle of energy and nervous, and then you put them in a situation too where people around them are telling them to act on those impulses. That can create a very different story of the causes of crime and the motivations of crime than one that assumes, okay, I'm going to steal this bread because I don't have a job and my wife needs food on the table and my kids. These are very different depictions of maybe the same action. So as I said, the radical thing of this that I always teach, because it's the hardest point to get sometimes, depends on the class, but this model, every cloud has its silver lining. For all the horrible things that Lombrosian positivism did, as we'll see throughout the course, and a central fault line is, this school, when you take out the genetic function, so take out the racist components, and the gendered components, and even more of the biological components, the lasting impression of this school is that it influences cure and rehabilitation models by saying people who are committing crimes and people who are deviating are often doing so because they find conforming difficult. And that rings very true to contemporary justice models on rehabilitation, where it says, let's look at the context that drove someone to do this. So if you get rid of determinism, you see if you get rid of strong determinism and replace it with weak determinism, and again, this is something you have to think through. It's challenging to think through, but think, okay, obviously it's very different to say, okay, let's say, person A is going to commit a crime because he had abusive parents, versus lighter determinism that says, you know what, maybe the fact that this person had abusive parents may make him a little bit more likely to commit crime than someone without those parents, or if he does, you could see that as influencing the process. So that's why this becomes, you can, critiques, as we'll see, of this perspective, see it as a slippery slope. Of once you start to remove people's agency and find external factors, you may lend yourself back to the view that said, oh, well, maybe he has no control over himself, and you're saying that everyone with those parents will do that. Yeah.
So, in terms of gay conversion therapy, under positivism?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so gay conversion, the Straight to Jesus campaigns and things, they're assuming that they're assuming that A, being gay is pathological, and B, that the person didn't choose it, or if they did, they've been misguided and can be rehabilitated to heterosexuality. Yeah. So, and again, that would be a weaker determinism. Because if it was the true Lombrosian, 100%, so let's say you just think of it as percents, if it's 100% determined, it's, well, you're born this gay deviant or something, and you're unfixable. But that would be a lighter positivism that says, no, you've somehow fallen into it, or you think you're tricking yourself, or you haven't found God, and we can get you back to normal. But it's still about, that would be about rehabilitating, but they would be seeing it as pathological. So no social worker would do that, because they don't subscribe to that strong of pathology.
So that would be considered like a weaker determinism?
Yeah. Exactly, and that's what these concepts, these are just things sociologists and criminologists make to understand human behavior. There's no hard and fast line. You could see gay conversion therapy as fitting the classical school, and that's why these are debates, right? Because someone could say, oh, they think they find pleasure from sleeping around with people of the same gender or whatever. They've somehow built this identity. Let's teach them that it's not rational because they can't have kids, they can't be normal, all of these things. So you could see it fitting in the other school too, but typically it follows these three principles. So I would say if you look at something, does it follow these principles? And then it's not 100%, because if it was, they wouldn't even do this, because there would be no rehabilitation. But it's 50 or 60% of them saying, okay, well, we've determined that being gay is not desirable, but we think you can be saved, so we're going to give you therapy. No?
I'm struggling to see the difference between the positivism, if you take out the genetic, like hereditary stuff. It seems like it's all about like controlling your environment. Like, how is that different from the classical, like your environment alters your decisions?
Because, great question. It's very much about your internal state and how the environment's impacting your internal state. That's the key difference. So in the rational theory, there's no discussion about how you may be interpreting your environment. It's just, okay, you're making rational choices based on the environment you're in. If you're taught that crime is okay, you'll do that. This one's much more complex. It's saying, you may be in a society where you're taught crime is bad, but you may have parents that teach you crime's okay. You may also be impulsive, and all of this mixes. So basically it's humanizing you in a way of saying there's more to you than just this rational calculation going on.
So this is more like an evolution of classicism rather than like a total dichotomy.
Exactly, yeah. So Lombroso was a total dichotomy. But that's why you'll see Durkheim and all of those other criminologists, and Merton in particular, with strain theory and talking about how people react to anomic societies, they would be mortified if they were called positivists, because they're like, no, I see that people are rational, but that their rationality is tempered by their society and it's influenced. But many more radical criminologists criticize that for saying, no, you're still assuming that people have a lot more agency in this process, or a lot less agency than they do. It's more blurry, yeah. These are the two, I'm presenting the two extremes, and then we'll see everything is like a blend of both. Because ultimately, if you were pure classical school, it would just be everyone's rational all the time about everything. And then pure positivism would be people have no agency. Anything you think, someone behaving rationally, oh, that's just the combination of their IQ, of their social environment, of their norms. So you would have one that's like you're a literal machine organism versus another one you're a free-floating brain. So, and that's the classic agency structure debate in sociology. So, yeah.
It's about the same thing as well, but I understood positivism as like nature versus nurture, right? So positivism is like more like nature focused, and other like sociological like theories as like nurture focused, like differential association theory. And like I'm really like struggling to see the difference between like determinism and differential association, because like it's to do with that like environment, like aggravating factors, and what makes the criminal, like more crime prone and stuff like that. So
you'll see with differential association, the key difference is there's still an element of choice. So differential association, as we'll see, association is once a person's learned a certain like threshold of deviant definitions. So if you hang around people that talk about deviance as being normal or desirable, that it will somehow just click, and then you'll become relatively a deviant. So that it's what they call in the discipline like a black box, like a theoretical black box. And so that black box leaves in some agency of the person could, resonate with that speech, or they could not. Whereas we'll see with strain theory, it's much more like, okay, if you are in a society where there's a discord between values and means. So we'll see next week the example of the American dream. So Merton talks about how everyone in America is taught, I want to be rich, I want to have a good education, whatever. But that different people have different access to actually do that. So people have different access to education, to networks. Then that creates this strain for people. And then there's 5 ways they can adapt to that. So we'll see Merton gets called a positivist. Same with Durkheim for saying that people will feel anomic or a disjuncture between this. Maybe they could enjoy that. Maybe they could build a subculture, like in differential association theory. So these things, again, it's great that you're picking up on this. I'm creating an intentional dichotomy because all of the scholarly arguments always, pretty much, come I'm not being deterministic about it, but almost every theoretical argument or argument between scholars is about the extent to which you've given or taken away people's agency when you've discussed them. That's one of the huge interventions that critical race theory and feminist theory, a lot of the more contemporary critical theories that they've said. They've like, well, you've made this population seem almost subhuman, that they can't make choices, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge that they have, structural oppressing factors. And again, how do you balance both positions without making it seem like, oh, I'm born in this context and you're saying it's not my biology, but you're saying I'm basically more likely to commit crime than other people. That's not a good way of portraying a population. And so I think, again, as we'll see, no one would really see themselves as being part of one of these schools, but they would tend towards the agency or structure. And we all have our biases, right? Again, given my own history of dropping out in video games and thinking about all these, doing my dissertation on difficult topics, I always find myself alternating between these because I like to think in my mind that we can make all of these choices whenever we want. But then I also know I'm a highly emotional person, and I think of all the contingencies that have shaped my life. And so I'm always going back and forth of saying, oh, am I in control of what I'm doing? So differentiation, so determinism is the hardest of these to get around. Again, and you should feel a bit confused about it because it's confusing. Otherwise it wouldn't be a foundational paradox. This is as deep as it gets. Descartes, the mind-body split, it's the central thing of, to what extent are we in control of ourselves? So differentiation's more simple. This is the assumption, again, that criminals are different from non-criminals. And so you see stronger and weaker versions of this. So Lombroso, they are different, they are bad, they are driven to this, get rid of them, versus weaker ones of saying, individuals that have fallen into lifestyles of crime may now find crime appealing. We should intervene and rehabilitate or change them. And then lastly, pathology, something is wrong with criminals. So we'll see this is the biggest separation between people that are more focused on agency and people that are more focused on structure or external influence. The extent to which we see crime as pathological will vary throughout different theories. Some theories will say crime is actually not inherently pathological. It's someone trying to create new norms, to follow new norms, whereas other theorists will see it as kind of a cry of frustration of people not being able to conform. So again, when you see any of the theories presented, so these 2 weeks are meant, last week and this one, are meant to orient all of your future reading. And you think, to what extent is this theory really emphasizing people's rationality, their ability to change, their ability to think through things, versus their tendency to be more spontaneous, more uncontrolled, and seeing deviance and crime as negative. So are you valuing it a certain way? Again, these all blur. There's, again, fantastic questions about these throughout. So how did this overall view start to fade? So positivism in its stronger iterations, so again, these discussions are always difficult because I'm defending positivism and the classical school using contemporary understandings. The arc of these theories, though, did go more from strong to weak over time. So again, it's useful to go back to the historical context. We had the classical school being politicians and people of means that were building off of Enlightenment values of everyone being the same, in a good way, of people being equal, people being rational. Then you had a series of thinkers, spearheaded by Lombroso, that started to say, no, all people are not created equal. Clearly, some people are different and criminals. Then that became weakened a bit, but the assumption was still very punitive and focused on pathology. So criminals were seen as people who, sure, maybe they weren't genetically different, but they kind of had fallen from grace. They kind of fell into a life of debauchery, and now they needed to be controlled and policed and changed. Right? So it was very punitive, very heavy. That's what makes it different from the contemporary view, where it's still, it's far from perfect now, but people were much more vocal back then about criminals being, very different from the regular population. So this started to crumble a little bit in the 1930s when much of the research on things like feeble-mindedness, so idiocy or stupidity as they would call it, studies on idiocy, studies on various genetic drivers started to become seen as implausible and debunked over time. And they were replaced more with, rather than focusing on big genetic disorders that people had, to potential ailments people were suffering from. So you started to see, this was the seeds really of psychological research starting to blossom. So rather than seeing people born with inborn tendencies towards irrationality, you started to see people suffering from mental afflictions and physical disabilities that maybe made integration in like normal life, presumably, made that more difficult. So handicaps, as they were called at that point. Again, not necessarily in a pejorative sense at that time, more meant in the literal word handicap, which is that a handicap is something that prevents you from doing something. It makes it more difficult for you. That was what was meant at the time. Now, obviously, that's seen as assuming that people with certain demarcations and certain ability differences are inferior. But at this time, I think, again, building on the positivism, the intent of this was more to be fair to individuals that maybe were at a disadvantage. So again, this was a response to the claims of people being degenerate, being debauched, being born evil, becoming evil, and saying no. Circumstances or certain genetic things may predispose people, but we can intervene, we can rehabilitate, and ultimately, I think the biggest thing, we need to be more sensitive about this. Because hitherto, or previously, it was not sensitive, it was very, again, punitive, meaning it was tough and cruel in many ways. Not that it became super nice right away, but it was the transition. So psychosocial and genetic factors started to become blended at this moment. Again, the evolution of psychology and sociology and then social psychology together were very important in this moment. So you'll see most of the theories we read in this class, they really start around like 1940 to 1970, because that's when a lot of the rejection of the more either totally agent or totally determined views were coming into fruition. And so your observations were totally right, that most theories you'll see, it's difficult to categorize them as being either positivistic or classical because they're deliberately trying to do both. But they all vary in terms of their assumptions. So key here is just the example I gave before of people looking at antisocial disorder. So antisocial disorder is a good case to look at because looking at that, you can acknowledge that certain people may be more introverted, may be more likely to get frustrated by interpersonal conflict. But that by acknowledging that someone has antisocial tendencies, you're not relegating them to a life of doom or stigma necessarily. You can say, okay, well, as someone that has social anxiety or agoraphobia, there are methods you can take to become, to find socializing easier with people. So things like depression, anxiety, these are things that you see someone as suffering from, but as overcomable, as treatable, and as ultimately not a life sentence on someone. Yep.
So is it almost like, in comparison to the classic theory, is it almost like antonym?
Yes. Yeah, so again, instead of seeing everyone as having universal capacity to rationality, here we're seeing a bunch of potential impairments, that each impairment, though, can be remedied. So it's saying, okay, you're assuming you have this population of people that are all totally potentially law-abiding. Now, by introducing psychological tendencies and environmental tendencies, that they literally condition the person. And you could say, well, actually, maybe the person isn't committing crime or deviating because they've rationally chosen not to in some abstract way, but they may have this antisocial disorder which makes them think they can't hold down a 9-to-5 job because when they get in fights with their coworkers, they've been fired, and we can help them with that. They could go to, or someone with aggressive issues, they could go to anger management classes. Someone who's very impulsive and feels they have no self-control or is addicted to alcohol, they can be intervened with. So again, this is where and this was a rejection of positivism, but using positivism's principle that people aren't in total control of themselves. So this is a more optimistic view of positivism, where you're saying, you know what, we can take the assumption that a lot of our behavior is determined from outside forces, and we can intervene in those forces. And so again, that's very different from just the classical school response, of 100% response of that could just be, well, grow up and be an adult. We all have our issues, but just don't commit crime and follow the law. Right? So you're a rational person, don't think that way. So very tough on crime approaches are often like that. They don't take people's contexts, either individual or social, seriously. So we have a video to watch on this. So this, I think, is interesting. So, and again, you had, I've taught this lecture 3 times, and these were the best questions I've got so far. You were already anticipating this video. So Jim Fallon, not to be confused with Jimmy Fallon. So although he tries to be funny too, so maybe when you have the same name, you adopt the personality. So Jim Fallon, he looks at psychopathic murderers. So that's why I use those examples. This is obviously a group of individuals that defy a lot of the theories that we use because they seem like people who are either choosing to be evil or are determined from something else. And people like Ted Bundy and Eileen Wuornos, the fascination with people like them is that they seem quite sane, for lack of a better word. So it's hard to think of how, particularly for Ted Bundy, how he makes those choices. You know, if you're a society that wants to believe people aren't naturally evil, it's hard to think of people like that. So what I want you to think, so what the main thing he's doing in this video is he's looking for a genetic explanation, but a genetic explanation that is inherently social. So he's looking at a latent gene that's triggered by trauma, and he makes a claim based on that. So watch for that in the video, and just think, imagine, and he jokes about it too, but imagine what society would look like if we started screening people for that gene. Now remember, it's not just having the gene that makes you the murderer, as you'll see. It's the gene being activated by certain things. But still, so I just want to think about what I've said, and he explains it very well. It's a short video.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire,
your brain is bathed in this, so your whole brain becomes insensitive to serotonin, so it doesn't work, later on. And I had given this one talk in Israel just this past year, and it does have some consequences. And theoretically, what this means is that in order to express this gene in a violent way, very early on, before puberty, you have to be involved in something that's really traumatic. Not a little stress, not being spanked or something, but really seeing violence or being involved in it in 3D. Right? This is how the mirror neuron system works. And so, if you have that gene, and you see a lot of violence in a certain situation, this is the recipe for disaster, absolute disaster. And what I think might happen in these areas of the world where we have constant violence, you end up having generations of kids that are seeing all this violence. And if I was a young girl somewhere in a violent area, 14-year-old, and I want to, find a mate, I'd find some tough guy, right, to protect me. Well, the problem is this tends to concentrate these genes. And now the boys and the girls get them. So I think after several generations, and here's the idea, we really have a tinderbox. So that was the idea. But then my mother said to me, I think you can go around talking about psychopathic killers. And you're talking as if you come from a normal family. So what the hell are you talking about? She then told me about her own family tree. Now, she blamed this on my father's side, of course. This was one of these cases, because she has no violence in her background. But my father did. Well, she said, as good news and bad news. One of your cousins is at Cornell University, but the bad news is that your cousin's also Lizzie Borden. Now, I said, okay, so what? We had Lizzie. She goes, no, it gets worse. Read this book. And here's this Still Strangely. It's a historical book. And the first murder of a mother by a son was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Okay, so that's the first case of matricide. And the book is very interesting. It's about, witch trials and how people thought back then. And it doesn't stop there. There were 7 more men on my father's side, starting at Cornell's, that were all murderers. Okay? Now, this, gives one a little pause. Because my father himself and my 3 uncles in World War II were all conscientious objectors, so pussycats. But every once in a while, Lizzie Borden, like 3 times a century, and we're kind of due. And so the moral of the story is, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, but more likely is this. Yeah. And we had to take action. Now our kids found out about it, and they all seem to be okay, but our grandkids are going to be kind of concerned here. So what we've done is I started to do PET scans of everybody in the family. We started PET scans, EEGs, and genetic analysis to see where the bad news is. Now the only person, it turns out, one son and one daughter, siblings, didn't get along, and their patterns are exactly the same. They have the same brain and the same EEG, and now they're as close as can be. But there's going to be bad news somewhere, and we don't know where it's going to pop up. So that's it.
Okay. Yeah, so just for sake of time, just talk. You don't have to write anything down on the card for this. So just talk with your group or pair briefly about this, and then we just have a couple slides left. I'll cover the second article. I already discussed a lot of the classical school, so just a little bit of routine activities. So just for a few minutes. Just sorry, I'm running a bit late because this class is a bit dense today, a bit packed. All right. So I'll take up responses to this after. I just want to get through. I always make it my mission to get through all the slides. So see, we don't have very many left. It's just, I think, 3. So, and I'll give you a tip. So to make sure before you go, next week for next class's readings, you'll see there's an article by Bursick on social disorganization. That one, read it, but you don't have to know all the little details in it. So and I'll try to tell you ahead of time which readings more to focus on. Focus more on the chapter, and I will try to explain more of that article. just because it is quite long, and I'm only going to have a few slides on it. There's kind of I'll try to give you more of the context of social disorganization theory. It was a bit challenging to find an article that summarized the theory, so it's quite in-depth. You do not, he goes in, he has all these criticisms and things. You don't need to know all of that. Just get a general idea of the article, but read the chapter in much more depth. And so it's the same with this too. I'll always, when we have articles or chapters, I will try to do my best to clarify the main points, because as I mentioned last class, some of the articles and chapters, they assume a lot of background knowledge. So here, the main contribution this article makes, I think, or this other chapter, for our understanding, is by clarifying some of the ideas of the classical school by saying that ultimately it's about rational choice. So the modern theory that subscribes to the classical school's rational choice theory. And then introducing routine activities theory, which says, okay, how can we intervene in people's rational choices? So how can we as a society make it seem less rational for people to commit crime? Well, as we'll see, routine activities theory says, it's not necessarily something people are internalizing or a genetic difference like that gene or trauma or anything like that, but it's the routine activities that people find themselves in. So routine activities theory says you need 3 elements for a crime. So it's not just having the person that sees crime as rational, but you need a suitable target and the absence of a guardian. So routine activities theory basically extends rational choice theory by saying that not only do people choose crime because it's beneficial for them, but there are certain external situations that will make crime seem rational. So an example of this, well, can anyone think of any examples of this? Because I think this is still used today. So imagine routine activities theory is get rid of contexts that make crime seem attractive and easy to get away with. Can anyone think of an example where this might be used? Yeah?
For a thief, for example, if a family, if the thief already knows that this particular house and the family members, they're going to go away for a vacation and the place is going to be completely empty for, say, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's way easier for him to, target them rather than trying to figure out the rest of the people. He doesn't know what other people's lifestyle is.
Exactly, yeah. So the article, the chapter discusses theft and shows how many crimes, not even just theft, go down when people stay at home longer. So the longer people are at home, the more they watch TV, crime rates go down because routine activities, as people are walking around, they see houses are populated with people. So a routine activity may turn into a crime. Let's say let's say I'm always walking by a store and I notice that they have no security system, they have their cash register always seems full. That's why you'll see at variety stores, there's often signs saying we never carry more than $100 cash. The whole movement of people using credit cards was largely influenced by thieves. Remember, so to Marx's point, they don't just create laws, but they create new things. People getting robbed, those highwaymen I told you about that were robbing people, that was one of the influences for people to not carry around cash. Traveler's checks, also things like that. So routine activities theory, again, extends rational choice by saying, okay, people are rationally choosing crime, and it's not necessarily, again, their socialization, their genes or whatever, but it's criminogenic environments. So environments that are making crime seem easy and fun. So that would also be policing youth, making sure they don't enter stores in big groups, trying to have more diverse groups of friends with kids so they don't fall into certain habits where we'll see that with differential association theory where they come to define deviance as normal. Basically cutting out of people's routine activities things that could make crime seem rational. So still subscribing to the theory that people are rational, but saying, hey, as a rational person, I'm seeing that it would actually be really easy to do this crime and I'd probably get away with it. Routine activities theory would say, okay, have more surveillance, or make people walk different routes, or turn on the lights at night. That's one thing that certain police stations have done. So rational choice theory in contrast, so sorry, just one thing I switched there. When I talked about punishment, again, swift, certain, and severe punishment, again, was in the rational choice of thinking of a person saying, okay, I shouldn't engage in this behavior because historically I've seen that people who have done this have been punished right away, it's been severe, and they've always been punished. So swift, certain, severe means, okay, I do the crime, the cops are gonna come after me, it's certain because people are caught a lot, and it's gonna be severe, like I'm gonna get a criminal record. Routine activities theory, again, is subscribing to that and saying, don't make crime so easy for people. So we'll see a policing model that follows that is broken windows theory. Broken windows theory is the idea that crime begets crime. So if you're walking in a neighborhood, for example, where it looks like most of the homes are abandoned, the stores are full of vandalism and graffiti, and a potential non-offender is likely to think, oh, no one, there's like this place is not policed very much. The movie Home Alone, I don't know if you've watched Home Alone, and think of the two criminals driving around, and then they find that and he's hidden there, and he was using these theories, he tried to make it seem like the house was full of people with the people dancing and whatever and the Christmas songs, and they eventually caught him, right, and said, oh no, actually this is there's an absence of a capable guardian, and it's a suitable target, it looks like a wealthy house. And so again, these theories, you know, someone using routine activities theory could explain that case. Someone else could say maybe those the two thieves had some sort of event in their life that made crime pay. So you could have different levels of explanation, but this is how they would study it. So rational choice theory, again, so don't get too confused with the distinctions, but rational choice theory is the modern iteration or version of the classical school. So basically, it's just, you know, it's focused on how you choose to offend. And so essentially, a person's gone through a thought process, and they've rationally deduced, using their logic, that the best way that they can get whatever it is they want. So if it's money, you know, I can't get a job, or like, you know, there's no workplaces in my neighborhood, I'm going to deal drugs to get it. If I want status, so this is very common if you see, you know, in stereotypes of like young men trying to make themselves seem more macho in front of young women, but just think of this logic, someone may think, okay, I'll impress this person by beating up this other guy. I'll impress this person by having an expensive car or going to the gym or whatever it is. Rational choice theory is your desire fuels your action, and what's mediating that, or what's in that process, are your beliefs. So it's desires and beliefs leading to the action. So if I really want a partner, but I feel I'm not attractive, I feel I'm not intelligent, or whatever the partner's looking for, I may then tell myself, okay, I need to be really rich. Now that could then lead me to another thing of saying, well, how do I get really rich? Oh, I don't have any real opportunities to do that. Maybe I'll get into crime. That may also make me attractive for being like dangerous or whatever. So this rational choice theory tries to dissect people's decisions in terms of all the calculations we make. So a rational choice theory of why you're all students could be, you know, you've thought about what you're going to do in the future. You're weighing all sorts of things. You don't want to be stigmatized by people. Like, you don't want to have to answer the question of, like, you know, what are you doing with your life? Why didn't you go to university? You may want to learn something intrinsically. You may really just want the job after. You may want to do higher academics. It doesn't get into the deeper questions, potentially, that, say, a positivist might ask of saying, okay, what commonalities make people choose university? Or even if you get more critical and structural, what about credentialization? What about confounding factors? What about underlying sources that really you have almost no say over? So we'll see later, I'm ending with that. You can think of McDonaldization, credentialization, so for people not in my intro class, just the concepts of university now itself kind of being a rite of passage. explaining people's choices to go to university from a rational choice perspective kind of brackets all of that. It makes it seem like we're all just choosing individually. But as a society, we also know that now university is kind of becoming the new high school, and to get the kind of job you want, many people feel they have to do this. So a more positivistic one would say, your choice to be in university is more fueled by like your desire just to have status in society. And so it's actually a big constraint on you, making you pick that. As much as you may have chosen it, it's also chosen by factors you haven't chosen. So I'll end with that, but again, these things, I tried to simplify them as much as I can, but this is the fundamental paradox of all sociology. So it'll only get easier from here because we'll be looking at one or two theories that are actual theories. So these are the two big schools, but we'll be coming back to them. And then tomorrow, so it works out perfectly, our first tutorial with Jason. So make sure you go to the tutorial tomorrow for the one you signed up for, or you can go to the other one. It's okay because we're a small class. And he will be, doing icebreakers, introductions, and going over some of this again, some of the complicated, because I know this is something I think hearing someone else talk about it and having more of you all hashing it out, I think would be useful. So not super structured or anything, more a Q&A session with some problem solving. Okay, so on that note, I'll see you next week. Remember, just to make sure we're all on the same page, for Quercus, so just looking at the syllabus, so both syllabi are the same, I just have one PDF in Word. For next class, always read all of the readings that I have, they're required, but focus more on tyranny, and then Bursic, again, it's quite long. You'll see a lot of it, he goes into all these criticisms. If I had the article in front of me, I would tell you what to, I can briefly show you just before I go. So, you'll see what I mean. There's a lot of complexity in it. But yeah, so there's one section in particular. Yeah, so the summary is really good. So the first 2 pages and the assumptions there. But it's when he starts getting into all the criticisms. So you'll see the bulk of the articles, these big criticisms. Those are good to know as background. But I will not be asking you for all of that because there's very, very detailed criticisms. Just in the beginning and the end, he has really great summaries. And do read the criticisms just because they're useful to know, and I'll be discussing some of them. But you'll see this is already, we're starting with a critical piece. So that's more why I chose this. It discusses it really well, and then it shows criticisms of other approaches and why they needed this. But focus mostly on the beginning and the end. All right. Yeah, and I'll collect the cards again. So, thanks. Thanks, you too. Thanks.